Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We are dealing with the resurrection of Jesus in Matthew 28, and I want to begin at verse 9. There, coming to meet them, was Jesus. "Greetings," he said. And the women came up to him, and falling down before him, they clasped his feet. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers that they must leave for Galilee, and they will see me there." It's very brief. It's very wonderful. What you have is that the women have already had an absolutely extraordinary experience of meeting the angel and going and checking that the tomb was empty. And Jesus waited until they had checked it, so that they had the information of his resurrection. All that was necessary now was for them to have it confirmed by actually meeting him, because the question, once Jesus is risen from the dead, the question is all over the place: where is he? Where will we find him? How will we relate to him? What will he say to us? What will we say to him? Do we need to be reconciled with him? And all kinds of questions, because of the way the disciples had reacted. And when Matthew describes the meeting between Jesus and the women, it's the same as if nothing had happened. In other words, he greets them and he gives them a message, as he would have done in the past. And so it must have been difficult for the women to take on board. Hang on, this incredible cataclysmic event has happened, and now we're talking to him as if nothing had happened. It's the real Jesus, it's himself. And this is what Matthew wants all of us to try and take on board. It's just that when Jesus greeted them, he said, "Charite," rejoice greatly. And rejoice greatly is, they've all been through it. They've all been through a moral and spiritual death experience. And now they have to try and take on board that he is genuinely risen. Now, if he's genuinely risen, this body will be real. The body of Jesus will be real. They're not actually seeing a vision. They're not seeing something that's inside of their heads. They're not seeing something that's incorporeal. And so they fall at his feet and clasp his feet. Well, you can't do that to a ghost, you know, because if you try and grasp a ghost, there's nothing there. And the Gospels make it very clear that the women clasped a real person. Okay, now to fall at his feet and clasp his feet means you grasp the person at the level of the ankles. And it can be pleading, it can be mourning if a person is mourning, it can be ecstatic joy as it is here. And it's the women trying to take on board, he's back, it's the real him, it's the real thing. And so these women are the primary witnesses, because they are able to go back and tell the apostles, not only did we get a message from heaven through an angel, not only did we check a tomb that it is actually empty, but we have met him ourselves, and it's the real him, it's the real Jesus, okay? I want you to note in verse 9 that Matthew says, there coming to meet them was Jesus. Perfectly ordinary, everyday language. He didn't say the risen Lord, he didn't say the conqueror, he didn't say the liberator, he didn't say the Lion of the tribe of Judah, he didn't say the victor, he didn't say any of the things that they would all say about him later. But here's your own Jesus coming back. Here's your Jesus. He said he would come back, and here he is. And so you have the stark reality of the word of God being fulfilled for you, because Jesus had promised it. So these women, as I have said several times already, are primary witnesses, and Mary of Magdala is the leader. Now Jesus is coming back to them as Redeemer and Victor and the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the King of the Jews, and he's coming back as their Saviour and all the other things that we know about him. But he's coming back as the new Adam to restart the human race, to restart history. The recreation of the human race can take place now because redemption is there available for absolutely everybody. And that's one of the many reasons why Jesus would tell them to rejoice greatly. And Easter is the time for trying to take on board just what God has done for us, okay? And the women falling at the feet of Jesus is the attitude of the church. It is adoration, praise, and thanksgiving for the infinite love that has been shown to us that we could never, ever deserve. And so in John's Gospel, this adoration comes to an absolute high point when Thomas, who didn't believe any of it, eventually said, "My Lord and my God." So this is the adoration, but we're shown this immediately from the women here. And the thing that they have to take on board is that the last time they saw him, he was unrecognizable because of the tortures he had experienced. Now it's the Jesus they knew. Now, because they are seeing the Jesus they knew, you know that Matthew is trying to tell you something else. And that is that Jesus has to forego all his glory in order to let them see something that they will recognize. If Jesus came to them in his awesome glory as the risen Lord, none of them would have been able to handle it at all. And so he has to diminish his glory. He has to diminish the light. He has to diminish the power in order to be able to receive them, and for them to be able to receive him in such a way that they would not be shocked and unable to handle it. And so he gives them a perfectly ordinary message. Now, these women would have carried messages for Jesus before, and they would have obeyed him during the years of his ministry. He said, "Go and tell my brothers." Now, I want you to notice something, that if you go back to verse 7, that the angel said to the women, "Go and tell his disciples." Jesus gives that slightly differently, "Go and tell my brothers." Now, there's a big difference between disciples and my brothers, because back in chapter 12, from verse 49, Jesus stretched out his hand to his disciples and he said, "Anyone who does the will of my Father is my brother and sister and mother." But we're all painfully aware of the fact that they've all let him down. They've all sinned against them, the whole lot of them. And they've all failed him dreadfully. But the forgiveness was given from the cross. Now, Matthew just didn't deal with that. Luke dealt with that. Most of them are not there to hear the forgiveness of Jesus from the cross. "Father, forgive them. They don't realize what they're doing." And none of them realized what they were doing ultimately. It was just fear and terror that had overcome them all. So when Jesus is saying, "Go and tell my brothers," he's saying, tell them nothing has changed between me and them. They're totally forgiven. They're totally accepted. I understood their weakness. I told them in Gethsemane, yeah, I know the flesh is willing, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so during the Passion, the flesh had won out, but that the spirit would in the end win out. And so Jesus is communicating this extraordinary knowledge he had of human beings. He was able to read them correctly. And even when they sinned against him, he knew Peter would recover. And he knew Peter would lay down his life for him in the end, when he had grown a lot. The main thing that the women were to communicate, if Jesus said, "my brothers," that the relationship was the same as if nothing had happened. That's forgiveness. That's forgiveness. There's not going to be this huge reconciliation thing needed in order to get the two of them together again. No, not at all. And finally, And most astonishingly for me, I don't know if you've thought about it enough to be astonished by this, he still trusted them to take the mission to the ends of the earth. They'd all let him down, every single one of them. And he still trusted them. And what you're looking at is the infinite love of God for us. And what you're looking at is that he puts more trust in us than we put in him. If only we put a little bit of trust in him, the thing would really work. It's really fantastic. But Jesus knew something else. And that is that when the apostles and disciples would go out on their mission, that they would have to deal with people failing and sinning. And they would have to be the priests giving them the absolution. And he wanted them to understand people's weaknesses. He wanted them to understand that they don't always accomplish what they want to do. And he most especially wanted them to understand that when the church would be persecuted, that some of them would fall away, and they were not to condemn them. They were to just give them time, because they would be able, some of them at least, would be able to come around afterwards, and that it would be very important. Okay. The next thing that's not obvious here, it's brought out much more strongly in John's Gospel than it is brought out here, and that is that the women are not allowed to cling to Jesus. That would be their instinct as women who love him, that they would want to be with him, and they wouldn't want to lose him again. But they have got to take on board the fact that history has changed between Friday and Sunday. This has been an absolute turning point in history. The incarnation is over. The days when you could cling to Jesus and you could sit with him and have a meal with him and argue with him and walk with him and all the rest of it, those days are over. Nothing's going to be the same. And so you've got to let the past go. Now, human beings find it very difficult to let something good in the past go. So I want to share something with you. Life offers us three things: good, better, and best. People who have the good find it very difficult to let it go to receive the better. And people who have the better, knowing it is better than what most people have, find it extremely difficult to let it go to receive God's best. That's the difficulty that the apostles have. What they had was so much better than everybody around them. And to let the past go and to let all their memories of the past go, just let it go, be in the present and receive the Lord now at a completely higher level. And you're going to be dealing with him, but on a purely spiritual level from now on. Therefore, you yourself have to grow. You yourself have to get up onto this higher plane, and so that you will be able to communicate with him. Now, the apostles who were so earthy and worldly and everything during the ministry of Jesus go into the Acts of the Apostles, and there's Peter in a trance, absolutely in the depths of prayer, receiving a revelation from God. And you say, wow, that's a miracle. It's wonderful. Incredible. Peter and the other apostles who were totally unable to even consider the possibility of suffering before the passion and death of Jesus, meet them in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 4, and they're bearing their backs for a scourging. And they walk out from the scourging with very, very sore bodies, glad to have had the privilege of suffering for the sake of Jesus. That's a first-class miracle. So what is happening from the passion of Jesus through the resurrection, through the descent of the Holy Spirit, is so monumental. I don't think most of us have taken it on board at all. So this is huge. And in the future, showing your love is going to be obeying the word. Now that's given very clearly in chapter 14 of John's Gospel as well. So let's move on to the next thing, which is quite dramatic, really. And so we'll move on into verses 11 to 15. While they were on their way, this means that the women get up walk away from the visible presence of Jesus to obey him. That is a miracle. That's one of the first miracles of the resurrection, because their whole instinct was to cling to him. But to walk away from this astonishing, incredible experience to obey him is the church beginning to rise from the dead. Much harder for the church to rise from the dead than it was for Jesus to rise from the dead. So while they were on their way, Matthew says it so simply that we read it quickly and therefore we don't realize the extraordinary grace that is being illustrated. So while that miracle was happening, some of the guard, that's the custodia that's been there at the tomb, they went off into the city to tell the chief priests what had happened. Wow, this is big. The custodia was given to them by Pilate because the Sanhedrin had broken the Sabbath, the great and sacred Sabbath, in order to go to Pilate to get this guard to make sure that they could keep Jesus in his tomb. And so there's two sets of witnesses running to Jerusalem. Neither the women nor those soldiers would have walked. They would have run as fast as they could. Both of them have unbelievable messages to share. One group, the women, go to the ecclesia, the new assembly of God's people, the new church, the infant church, and the other group go to the leadership of old Israel, and they go to the priesthood. One of the little details that you might miss is that while the authority of the Sanhedrin has been removed from them, they will limp on until AD 70 for 40 years. And so God still honors them on this day by making sure that the priesthood of Israel is told the truth of the resurrection. Whether they heard it before the apostles or not, we're not told. It's most likely that they did, because the lives of these custodia was at stake. That's terribly important. And so they would tell the truth to the Sanhedrin. So it's the way God is honoring this priesthood when they absolutely do not deserve it that I find completely fascinating. Okay, so two messages go to Jerusalem at the same time. And two messages will come out of Jerusalem as a result of it. And one message will be the truth, and the other message will be falsehood. Satan's not finished. Satan lost the battle on Calvary, but he's not going to give up. And he's going to make it as impossible as he can for the message of the resurrection to get out. And if the message gets out, he's going to twist it. He's going to create confusion so that he can make it as difficult as possible for the early church to get off the ground. Now you know we have an enemy, and he's the one to fight. So I'll leave it there and complete Matthew's Gospel for you in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Slán agus Banach Dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
The work of Shalom is an essential part and a powerful part of the work of evangelization, of promoting the objective of sharing the good news of the gospel, the joy of the good news of the gospel and its promise of salvation in this life and beyond death in the new life of the risen Lord. Its evangelization of culture and civilization is a most important objective for the people of God and the church right around the world. In this 21st century, when the human family is battered by so many forces of change, of uncertainty, forces which seem to threaten and menace hope, the hope of the risen Christ and of the good news of the gospel is something which has to be shared not only between individuals, but with communities of peoples right around the nations of God's earth. May the Lord bestow his blessing on the work of Shalom, on all who are associated with it, and also indeed on all those who through their charity and kindness support its most important work.